Our first step in this process is to configure our Radius server. And for the first step in that process, I want to show you that over here under Add Roles and Features that I've gone through installing the NPS, or Network Policy Services, role and then the associated role service onto this machine. You'll see down here Network Policy and Access Services and the single role service that we're interested in here at this point in time. Later on when we get into NAP, we'll be also installing the Health Registration Authority, but for now all we need is the Network Policy Server role service. With NPS installed onto this machine, we can come down here to our Network Policy Server console and go through the configuration of NPS. Now remember, this is our NPS server, our Radius server. And so the job here is to configure, number one, the server itself, and number two, the different clients that we ultimately will need to connect with. When we make these configurations, we have a couple of different use cases that we can use in order to get ourselves started. The first of which is NAP, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. And then the other two have to do with either dial-up/VPN connections or 802.1x wireless or wired connections. I kind of hinted back in that early module when we were talking about how a Radius proxy or even a Radius server itself can be used not only for external devices like those that sit over in a DMZ, but it can also be used for authenticating other kinds of devices that may potentially be on your LAN, like wireless devices or wired devices that need some sort of IP security. It's this last of the use cases down here that supports those internal functions. The discussion on either of these is best left for another day. I would be aware, however, that NPS can support both of these two different kinds of authentication. But for now, let's kind of focus our attentions here on connecting up our NPS server instead to our other server, Remote 1, through a VPN connection. So let me come down here and we'll configure just the initial wizard here to set this up as a VPN server or the authentication for that VPN server. Notice this is different than the dial-up connections you can see up there, but we have that ability, if you happen to have some banks of modems somewhere, to use this as a mechanism to authenticate dial-up connections as well. We'll let it populate a name down here, and then we can identify now what the Radius clients, or who the Radius clients should be, that will ultimately then use this machine as their source of authentication. If I punch in here add, you'll notice we can add in a new Radius client where I can punch in the friendly name. So remote1.company.pri, and I can copy that down to the next item down here. And then also I can come down here to the bottom and identify the shared secret, essentially the password that is kept on both machines in order to authenticate the connection between the two. This shared secret should be something that is sufficiently large. And in fact, you can have the wizard here generate your own shared secret, which, as you can see, is an exceptionally large series of letters, numbers, and characters. Remember that it's this shared secret, the long series of characters, that is the mechanism to authenticate one to the other. So you could think of it as something more than a password, but something less than a certificate. I will actually cheat because, well, I don't want to have to punch in all that information and choose a very simple shared secret of perhaps just 1, 2, 3. Again, I have to know what this is so that I can copy and paste it over into the Radius client for when it comes time to complete the connection over on the other side. When I hit the OK button here, that will create this Remote 1 machine as a Radius client. So this NPS server will begin listening once we complete the wizard here for authentication requests from remote1.company.pri. I can then choose next here to identify the different authentication methods. Now, if you were with me back in that earlier course where we talked about the variety of different authentication mechanisms that a client would use to connect up to their remote access server, it's here where we can choose how those methods will be used in order to authenticate any of the information coming between these two machines. So on the outside being our remote access server and on the inside being our NPS server. Right now, by default, the MS-CHAP v2 is the option that's selected here, but we could enable the extensible authentication protocol here as well. In doing that, that would allow us to add some other more secure methods for authenticating and encrypting the communication between these two machines. This could be things like smart cards or other certificates, protected EAP, which actually is required a little later on when we need to use network access protection, or EAP MS-CHAP v2. I will choose MS-CHAP v2 here for reasons that will make more sense as we move into the client connection piece here in just a second. I'll choose the next button here, and it's here where we can define which users should be allowed or denied access through that remote access server, Remote 1. Now remember, this doesn't have so much to do with access to our NPS server. You can think of the NPS server as kind of a glorified domain controller. Rather, this is intended to identify once someone authenticates, well, is that user actually authorized to then connect up to internal resources? So for this, I'll choose the Add button here and then punch in something really easy like our domain users group. So these users first are authenticated, but then are authorized to then access internal resources. Again, this has everything to do with the remote access server itself. I'll choose Next here, and we can now choose any IP filters. This should all be very familiar to how we configured things back in that earlier course. When we were configuring the remote access server, we had to configure IP filters there as well, both on the input side as well as over on the output side. So these are filters that will define which IPs, which destination addresses, which destination network masks and source network masks will be permitted to occur over that connection. I'll leave these just blank for now, and we won't actually set up any kind of templates just yet because we just want to allow all the communication to occur once that user has authenticated. I'll come down here and choose Next, and it's here where we can define then what the encryption settings can be. We have up until this point defined authentication settings, or essentially what sort of protocols will be used to authenticate the user and make sure they are who they say they are. It's now here where we can define what protocols will be used to encrypt the data that goes from one machine to the other. Any of these options can be configured. If you're in a high security environment or have special requirements, you may want to only allow, for example, the strongest encryption. But these give you the abilities to define what kind of inbound encryption support may be coming from those machines out on the other side. Some machines may not support, for example, some of these newer versions of encryption that are at a higher bit level. So I'll leave all these here enabled to support all the possible clients that may come in. If I choose Next here, I can then define the realm name for the clients. You can think of this realm name as a mechanism to either obfuscate your internal domain name or perhaps provide a layer of abstraction over your internal domain name. Entering in a realm name here presents a way for users to punch in some other realm, some other namespace that they would use to authenticate. That would then be stripped off and replaced with your actual Active Directory domain name, should you so choose, when it comes time to process the actual authentication here inside. In many situations where you'd be configuring this for a single company, perhaps in a single domain, single forest scenario, you probably wouldn't find yourself configuring a realm name here. But as you can see, in a world where an ISP would, for example, be connecting up to multiple different Active Directory forests, and on the other side through multiple different devices that would be coming in, well, these realm names, again, provide that layer of abstraction for the users and their authentications coming in. We'll leave things blank here because when we want users to authenticate, we want them to do so using their usual domain name. I'll choose Next here, and you can see this completes the VPN or dial-up wizard here, which then also completes at least the first part of configuring up this Radius server.